Hello, hello. This is Eric Carlson. I am a animator and designer, and recently did a little animation challenge with a couple coworkers, and so we all kind of used these parameters and made our own projects. And I just am going to share some of that process with you guys. So first, to do this animation challenge, we had to choose three stock photos, and the way we came up with those was by doing a word generator website thing. And so we went here, hit generate random words, came up with a word. The word we got was place. And so then we went onto this free photos site and searched for place, and then ended up with photos here. So once we got our results for that randomly generated word, we could pick three of those photos, and then we had to make an animation of some kind using only those three photos. So we couldn't bring in any other assets or do any illustration or bring in any video or anything like that. We could only make things from those three photos. And then we had only 90 minutes, an hour and a half to make it, which for animation is a really tight amount of time. So this would kind of force us to have to think creatively, turn off our inner editor, not have any time for perfection, and which was kind of freeing for us, I think, because it's easy to hone things further and further and further and do all kinds of tweaks and work on a project for weeks on end, which is a lot of what we do in our regular work. And so this is kind of a nice way to break away. So here's what I made in my hour and a half using three of those photos. So who knows what it means, some kind of trippy thing. My coworkers thought it looked like a kind of dream sequence, which I like. So there it is. So let me walk through some of what I did. So first of all, I chose these three photos. And so what I did is I started by just making a bunch of cutouts of things that I thought might be handy that I might want to use. So just cut out this guy, this thing, that, and that. And the cutouts are pretty rough. I think I used the pen tool to make them, but there are definitely some very jagged edges, so just trying to be as quick as possible. But I initially wanted to just cut some pieces out and decide what I wanted to work with. So there's this photo. This is the other one I used here. So I grabbed that guy and this pillar, and I'll tell you also why I chose these photos. And then this one, and here are the pieces I chose, like a tree, telephone pole, sign, the Hollywood sign, and a car there. We actually used to have an element, a Honda Element, so that was kind of, maybe that's why I subconsciously picked that one. But I like this because it had trees, and I thought I could do something cool with like a blowing tree maybe, and kind of build a little 3D landscape, which I always love doing. This one had that little guy. I immediately thought maybe I could use him as a kind of weird rotating repeated element. And then this just has some nice details in it. It's very crisp, and I figured I could cut out some of these individual things. So that's how I chose those. So now let's go back to After Effects. 1 second. So the setup for this, so as I went, I kept kind of refining my approach because I had no idea what I was going to do going into any of this. None of us did. So I started pretty early on. I decided to get a camera set up. So if we go into this view here, you can kind of get a little bit more of the layout of the scene. I think actually maybe before I did the camera, I think I did the tree thing. So I just kind of started with things I knew I wanted to animate, and then I animated them and then saw how that looked. So if we go to the tree, I put some pins in. I used Duick Basil, the free rigging animation program or plugin for After Effects, and then used some random wiggles on all of these points so they would kind of rotate on their own randomly. And then once I did that for the tree, then I went to tree wiggles. So then I used motion tile to make a bunch of these and just had them kind of moving around like that. And then inside the main composition, I just had all these tree wiggle layers and just set them up kind of near the camera, and then had the camera kind of pushing up and going through them almost. So that's how I started, and I set up the camera move around that time. And then I started putting in more things pretty quickly. I put the photo itself in the background, but really blurred, just to give a kind of nice backdrop. and then I put it on the ground because why not? And I could only use the photos, so I just figured that would kind of go well with the lighting of everything else. And I started just putting in weird little things. So I have let me show you that little guy, called him Dude Swim. So here's this guy moving along. Again, I use motion tile. And I use this to make it a little bit more interesting. And then inside of that, I just had an expression to have him rotating over time. I like doing rotations that repeat like this with an expression because then you don't have to set a start and end key. And you can just quickly adjust the pacing. So if this felt too fast, maybe I'll go down to 30 and then it'll go a little bit slower. But that seemed pretty good. So yeah, did that. And then I like the idea of this kind of being almost like a river, like some kind of undercurrent thing moving along the ground. And then once we get up here, I brought it back in a kind of blurry way over there. So it's almost like I was having to make two primary layouts or views. So this is like almost like I think this is loosely inspired by that Hollywood photo. So it's kind of like you're down on the street and like in some kind of busy city area. And then you're up above looking toward the sky. And then in the distance, so you see I have the Arc de Triomphe. And that I just duplicated a bunch of times. And then I also duplicated it and put it in the air because I like having some sort of 3D texture. So for example, there's one of the copies. I don't know if that shows up too well in this video, but you can kind of see the shape of that there. So it just gives you some more depth because you feel like you're flying through these different layers, almost like a fog kind of effect. And then there's this little guy down here who I made wiggle, and I wish he showed up a little bit better. Let's see, where is it? Oh yeah, my organization on this was kind of wonky, but in 90 minutes, you don't have that much time to really hone things. But him, I just gave a bunch of random wiggles, so he just kind of is doing this, kind of a jello guy. But then if you go in here, you can't really see it that well, but he's definitely, there are copies of him down there just sort of doing this little wiggle thing. But we're just moving pretty fast, so you don't really see it. So let's see, a couple other quick things. I don't want to make this too long. So obviously I didn't use a lot of my cutouts. I did use this thing. I put this thing in the foreground. I like having something near the camera, so you can kind of have something you're moving past, and it makes the scene feel a little bit more fleshed out, I think. Let's see, the Hollywood sign didn't use some signs. So but I'm glad that I had those assets to choose from to begin with, and those are things that I knew that I could cut out quickly in Photoshop and tweak easily in Photoshop, so I just did it there. But yeah, so I had to make sacrifices. I think I started with this as an HD comp, and then I pulled back to 1080 by 1080, which is one of the default Instagram sizes, and then even from there, when I rendered, I had to do it at half resolution because we had like 15 minutes to go and I was starting to render and full was way too slow. So I did half resolution. This is 12 frames a second, which was originally 24. So then I rendered it and then I brought it back in. I brought the video in. I scaled it up to that 1080 size. So it's definitely a little bit fuzzy. And then I turned on frame blending. I hit it twice to get a little bit higher quality, which doesn't always work, but in this case it worked okay, so I kept it. And then I also changed the frame rate here. So with that frame blending, it kind of filled in the motion. If I hadn't turned it on, it would still stay at the same frame rate. And it works really well. So I then bumped this out, and the frame rate looked totally smooth. You wouldn't be able to tell that it started at 12. And it is fuzzy, but that kind of goes with the aesthetic. I mean, even this here in the foreground is too low resolution, so that's pretty kind of pixely. But yeah, it was fun, and there were a lot of other things I thought maybe I could try, but there just wasn't time. I wanted to try some depth of field on the camera or some cool 3D light effects, but there just wasn't time. So, but yeah, all in all, a fun exercise. I recommend stuff like this to get the creative juices flowing. Just give yourself a really strict time limit, and if you can do it with other people, that helps a lot. The other animators I worked with, we all just showed up at 6:30 sharp, and then by 6:45 we were starting in this. 8:15 was our cutoff, and then we shared what we'd done, and it was just good accountability and motivation. So I hope this was informative and maybe inspiring to just try making your own thing. It doesn't have to look nice. It can be really rough around the edges. So enjoy. See you later.